So, as we head into this fall, I'm really excited to be inviting applications for my next level nonprofit program. I'm also excited about a few shifts in my own thinking that won't change the program itself, but will impact how you hear me talk about it. And I want to share them here because I think they're meaningful. Since I started the program years ago, many, many moons ago, I've always called it the Next Level Nonprofit Accelerator. But increasingly, that's just out of alignment with my own energy and focus and way of moving through the world. And it doesn't resonate with what I believe leaders of small and growing nonprofits should actually be focused on. I work with deeply committed, incredible leaders inside this program. And the thing they need is not to accelerate their growth. They don't need to move faster and figure out how to hustle harder. That's not the key. And more, thankfully, as a sector and as individuals, we're seeing that. Hustle harder is not the key. Leading and growing an impactful organization is about sustainable growth. It's about setting a bold, exciting vision for change and impact. And then when you get there, looking back and knowing that you've built an institution that can help you stay there. It's about finding and leading from your zone of genius and not just avoiding burnout, loving what you do and feeling connected to your team and supported by your board and inspired by your work and by your impact without the constant overwhelm. So I've renamed the program to the Next Level Nonprofit Mastermind. It's still about taking your nonprofit to the next level, but we do that through all of the things that make masterminds one of the most powerful growth tools I have ever experienced or come across. Powerful, deep wraparound coaching support from me and the other expert coaches in the program, highly personalized guidance and planning support and feedback on everything from an audit of your core plans to reshaping your budget to redrafting emails to your board. And finally, the mastermind part is about getting access not just to a remarkable peer community, but also access and connections to a handpicked and curated network of marketing experts, fundraising experts, board coaches, finance gurus, people who can actually help you do your work better and stronger. So the core of the program hasn't changed, just that I'm renaming it to reflect what I think is its true gift and its true power. If you would like to apply to work with me and the coaches inside the Next Level Nonprofit Mastermind, you can apply at brookericchiebabbage.com/Next Level Nonprofit. Hi, this is the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast, and I'm your host, Brooke Richie-Babbage. Each week, I do a deep dive into the mindset and strategies and tactics and tools of scaling an incredible, high-impact nonprofit. I'm so glad you're here. We are headed full steam ahead into one of my favorite times of year, planning season. Planning is very top of mind for folks inside my Next Level Nonprofit Mastermind, and I'm having conversations every day with leaders who are starting to map out not just their end of year events, but what next year is going to look like, what work they're going to focus on, how much it's going to cost, and how they're going to raise what they need to get them there. So I want to talk today about one of the most powerful resources that you have in your planning. It's a not so secret weapon to make sure that you're aiming your time, your money, and your energy at the right things in the new year. It's your long-term strategic plan. Now, some organizations, some of you may have a 5-year plan, and for reasons that I'm not going to deep dive into here, I always coach and teach a 3-year plan. Either way, your long-term plan is the most important container and guide for your annual planning. And I want to talk about how you can leverage it as such. So just to make sure we're on the same page about why I'm focusing on this long-term plan, your long-term plan is a guiding document. It's a roadmap to make sure that you stay on course as you move forward across years, right? Your long-term plan tells the story of your focus. There are so many ways that you can allocate your time and your resources. So many stories you can tell about where you want to take the organization across years, right? Further time horizon than just this year. So your long-term plan is what tells your board and your team, this is the kind of work we're going to pursue. This is where we're going to lean in and say yes. And this is what we're going to move away from and say no to, right? So you do that thinking upfront so that you have a guide, sort of a map across 3 or 5 years. And if it's created and leveraged correctly, it also allows you to confidently say, we are focusing on going deep in these areas rather than these other ones on a year-to-year basis, right? That focus, that long-term sort of container should create a shorter, smaller container for your annual planning, your annual budgeting, and your annual fundraising strategies. The purpose of your annual plan is really to notch down the priorities and goals in your longer term plan and to sharpen your focus on just the coming year. That focus, that sharpness of focus, is the key to real impact and sustainability. It's what keeps you from being too diffuse and scattered and trying to do everything so that your board and your team and your donors are actually confused. So as you head into your annual planning conversations, it's super important that your strategic plan, your 3 or 5 year plan, I'm just going to say 3-year plan for the purposes of this podcast, it's super important that your 3-year plan be solid and that the vision and priorities and goals that are serving as your long-term North Star are clear and able to be translated into annual priorities and goals. So that's what I'm going to walk through today, how to audit your strategic plan so that it can serve as the compass to your annual planning. I've also created a quick strategic plan audit cheat sheet that you can download at brookerichiebabbage.com/strat-plan-audit. So the first thing you want to do is audit your strategic vision. You want to make sure that it can serve as an inspiration and as a beacon for your team and your external supporters. Your vision, your strategic vision, is a statement about what the organization hopes to become in the semi-distant future, the organization that you will be and the impact that you will have. Now, I want to distinguish this from your organizational vision statement. A lot of organizations have a mission and a vision statement. When they go together, they complement one another. The organizational vision statement looks outward. It is, like I said, it's a complement to your mission. It's about how the world will look, the external world will look, if your organization were to achieve its mission. The strategic vision is internal. It says, if we build and grow the way we want, this is the kind of institution we will have become, and this is the kind of impact we will be having. It tells supporters, this is the community, the culture, the cathedral we're building, and that we are inviting you to be part of. So we talk about this a lot inside my coaching program. I go on and on about the importance of strategic vision statements because I think a lot of organizations in their strategic planning processes skip over it and want to go right to what are we going to do. I think that if you do that, you actually not only leave a lot on the table, but you will almost always wind up with priorities and goals that are less focused and less effective. So I talk about the strategic vision, sort of how to craft one in a few past podcast episodes, and I'll share links to those in the show notes. What I want to talk about here is how to look at a strategic vision statement, if you have one, and just make sure that it's an effective guide to your planning process. So there are 6 key attributes of an effective strategic vision statement. You want your statement to be clear, concrete, future casting, inspiring, motivating, and purpose-driven. So I'm going to walk through each of these. When you look at your strategic vision statement, ask yourself, is it clear? This means basically avoid buzzwords and jargon. So jargon is basically technical slang, and it's language that means something specific to one group but can be interpreted completely different by outsiders or just not even understood by outsiders. It's not inherently bad. And I know it gets a bad rap. It can actually help bring like-minded people together around a similar cause, right? It gives them a shared language, sort of verbal shortcuts for working together. The problem is that while jargon can feel both natural and easy in our everyday language, right? We're talking to people who understand prenatal health, or we're talking to people who understand the prison industrial complex. Its use in documents that have to go out into the world can also be a sign of either lack of clear thinking, right? Meaning you know the easy way to say it, but you can't actually explain it to, a 10-year-old without using the jargon. It can also make people feel like outsiders. So you want to be careful that your strategic vision statement, because this is a document that you're hoping will bring new people into your world, doesn't include jargon that can exclude people. And you also want to make sure you're using plain language, which is always more powerful than jargon. So as you read through your statement of strategic vision, if you find that it is falling back on buzzwords, try isolating that phrase or that buzzword and then asking a friend, a family member, what do you think this means? Right? If I were to explain this to you in plain language, how would you want me to explain to you, right? What language would you use? And then think about replacing those buzzwords with the plain language. So that's the first thing. Is your statement clear? If it is clear, you are far more likely to be able to draw on it in your annual plan. Second, is it concrete? You want to avoid ambiguity. Vision statements that don't have a sort of concrete way to be interpreted leave themselves open to misinterpretation and really conflicting interpretations. They can mean different things to different people. And while that might seem on the front end like it's good, I've definitely talked to leaders who think, oh, that's good. Like we'll bring more people in. Actually, it just means that people don't know if you're talking to them, right? They don't know if the vision for impact that you're describing or the kind of institution you're talking about is really for them. Third, is your strategic vision statement future casting? So you want your statement to look beyond the organization's current circumstances and demonstrate an understanding of where you think you'll fit among emerging trends, societal shifts, and other future possibilities. Does your statement align your goals, right, where you're going, with where the world is headed, with where the issues that you care about are headed, particularly for organizations that do social justice work, work that implicates or bumps up against policies and laws? That can be really important as a signal. This is what we aspire to be, right? We illuminate the ways in which our organization can either help shape this future, be at the forefront of change as a leader, make sure that you are situated in this future that society is moving towards. Next, is it inspiring? Now, this one's really important. Your board, your staff, your donors, they have to see language that evokes emotion and excitement. It creates enthusiasm. It gives them something to strive towards. The more vivid an image of the vision that you can create in people's heads, the more effective your vision is going to be as an organizing call, right? For the people who you're inviting to be part of making this vision a reality. And finally, related to is it inspiring, is it motivating? Does it actually clarify the direction in which your organization is going? So this, an example of this could be, we will be serving 1 million young people around the world, right? That's a really particular direction, right? That clarifies where you're going and that motivates people. It pulls people in that direction. It motivates and pulls the right people, the people who are excited by that, in that direction. So as you begin your annual planning, you want to ask yourself, go back through your vision, ask these questions, And then ask yourself, is the work that we're thinking about for this coming year in alignment with this vision? Is it clear how each of the things that we have planned, the campaigns, the programs, the launches, the work, the thought leadership, is it clear how those things move us in the direction of this vision? Right? Can we see a through line from what we're talking about doing in the next year to what we've said we want this organization to be doing and how we want it to be 10 years from now? So at a high level, that's what you want to be asking yourself as you sit down for your annual planning. That's how you use your strategic vision, your long-term strategic vision, as the sort of outer container for your planning. It's a gut check, and it's a really important one, because if the answer is no, you can look up 2-3 years into a strategic plan and you have work that feels good on the ground level, but you haven't achieved the things in your plan. And that actually undermines really all of your strategic planning processes. It makes it harder to talk to funders on any longer term basis when they don't see a relationship between what you're doing this year and where you've said you want to go. So the second part of your strategic plan that you want to audit after you've looked at your strategic vision are your priorities. I talk all the time about how critical, how absolutely important strategic priorities are in a strategic plan. The fact is that your organization simply can't solve all of the problems experienced by your target population or your community in any given 3 or 5 year period. You will inevitably be presented with more options and opportunities than you have the time or the capacity or the money to take advantage of. That's just life. That's just normal. That means that you have to make choices, hopefully strategic choices, about which specific organizational and programmatic areas you are going to focus on and where you are committed to having the greatest impact. And by choosing to focus on a narrow set of priorities, and I always recommend 3 or 4, no more than 5, your organization is going to be able to execute those well rather than multiple initiatives poorly. And just like with the vision, I'm not going to get into how to craft priorities here or sort of go up on my sort of high horse about why they're so important. What I will say is that often when organizations have a hard time with major donors, with multi-year funders, when they feel like the fundraising piece and the sort of marketing piece of their work is just not clicking, a big part of the problem is they have too many priorities. What they have is a laundry list of work they are going to do. And it's compelling work and it's exciting work, and they can justify all of this. But a laundry list of work is not a set of strategic priorities. And what happens when a funder or a donor looks at the 7 or 8 areas of work that you're focused on, it can't, that funder or that program officer can't tell what matters more and how you're actually allocating time and energy and why these as opposed to other ones. And of these 7 or 8 areas of work, are there ones that you're spending more time on? And those questions are in people's minds. And when they are not answered, when there's no sense making, which is part of what the narrowing does, it makes sense of your work for external stakeholders. When you don't do that for them, they don't do it for themselves. And so a lot of times, sort of further along in our work, we see that board members aren't fundraising for us and, it's not quite clicking with funders. If we peel back the onion, it often in the work that I've done comes back to these priorities. So I said I wasn't going to get on my high horse. I did. That's my rant. I have also talked about how to craft effective priorities, and I'm going to include some links in the show notes around that. What I want to talk about here is how to audit your priorities so that you can use them for annual planning. So we talked about how to do it for strategic vision statement. There are also 6 attributes for effective priorities, and they are very similar to the ones for, some of them are very similar to the ones for strategic vision. So the first, clear, concrete, and inspiring, right? And we've talked about those. The other ones are narrow. So you want to make sure, and I just talked about this a little bit, that your priorities are limited to a handful. A narrow set of clear priorities tells people that you've done this hard work of making trade-offs. And as it pertains to annual planning, when you sit down to think, okay, there's so much we could do, we're sort of in mid-flight with a lot of the work, where are we going to focus our time and energy in the coming year, just the next 12 months? Where are we going to put a stake in the ground and say, this is what we're going to be accountable for, and we're going to slow down on these areas of work or pause these areas of work or not take on new partnerships here? That kind of annual planning or strategic annual thinking should be rooted in a narrow set of priorities. And the narrower and more focused your long-term priorities are, the easier that annual work is, because you've done the work of saying, this is what we want to focus on, right? So you want to look and audit to make sure that they are narrow. Now, if you look and find that you do have this laundry list of sort of areas of work, let's call them, you have a lot of areas of work and they're not narrow, you have 8 or 7 instead of 3 or 4, what you want to do in your annual planning process is go back and do some of the narrowing on an annual basis and say, okay, these are the 7 or 8 areas of work that we've said we're going to focus on over the span of our long-term plan for the next year. Which of these long-term priorities do we want to focus on? Right. So still staying in the realm of your long-term strategic plan, do the narrowing and the focusing at that level, and then notch down to within these 2 to 3 priorities, where do we want to focus in the next year? And the reason that you want to stay up at the sort of long-term priority level for that first initial narrowing is that's how you will make sure that your day-to-day thinking, your month-to-month planning, the goals that you set on an annual basis are still related in some way to longer-term thinking, right? So the general rule of thumb is go from longer-term narrowing to shorter-term narrowing, right? So that's how you audit that part of your priorities. Make sure that you have a narrow list that you are starting from as you think about the smaller containers for your annual plan. Next, you want to ask, have you provided a concise explanation of what each priority means? Right? So providing concise descriptions that flesh out your priorities help to elaborate the priority and make it clear to everybody exactly what they mean. So one example might be you have a priority of expanding to new communities. Does your strategic plan explain that you are expanding to new communities as part of a growth strategy and establishing partnerships in low-income rural communities, right? So it's not just that you're expanding to communities, you've actually explained what the priority means. It's part of a growth strategy, right? And the way that you're going to do it is partnerships, and where you're going to do it is low-income rural communities. So you want to make sure that it's really clear what the priorities are prioritizing, right? What they include. That helps your annual planning because it's that level of detail that you want to make sure your annual goals are aligned with. Right? If you've said you're expanding into new communities by establishing partnerships in low-income rural communities, right? That's what that priority means. That's the particular stake you're putting in the ground. Then when you sit down in the coming year to map out the work, right, the goals that you're going to do within that priority area, the questions that you ask yourself are more targeted, right? They're more focused. Which low-income communities? How are we defining low income? How many low-income rural communities? What kind of partnerships? That's a much more focused and specific list of questions to help you then operationalize the priority. And so that's why that specificity and clarity of the explanation of the priority is important. And then the last thing you want to do when you're auditing your priorities in your long-term plan is have you explained why each matters? So you want to make sure that you and everybody on your team who's doing your annual planning can look at the long-term priorities and understand why they matter strategically and how they're going to help you achieve the long-term impact that's in your vision. So using the example above that I just talked about above, you may want to say why a commitment to new partnerships is important to your planned impact, right? Why you are expanding into new communities through partnerships as opposed to setting up new offices, right? You might say new partnerships within existing communities actually helps us to establish roots in those new communities in authentic ways that reflect the norms of those communities rather than bringing in our own external norms. That makes sense, right? So now, as people are thinking about their annual work planning and they are identifying the number of new partnerships in which low income rural communities, they understand, oh, part of this is we want to make sure that we find partners that have roots in that community, right? We want to make sure we partner in a way that is respectful of those roots, where that community partner is the leader in the partnership, right? Rather than us sort of bringing our external stuff into the community. That helps give shape to your annual goals and how you plan your work on an annual basis, right? When that longer term priority is clear. So that's how you want to audit your strategic priorities: clear, concrete, and inspiring, and then narrow, well defined, and contextualized, right? Why does each matter? Now, the final part of auditing your strategic plan is looking at your long term goals. And here, you want to make sure that the goals themselves are smart, right? But in particular, SMART goals, as people have talked about. But in particular, I'm going to ask you or suggest that you focus on the S, the M, and the T, right? They are specific, they are measurable, and they are time bound. Attainable and relevant, that's the other two letters. So specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. And I personally also add equitable to the end. Those are all super important. But as it pertains to annual planning, it's really the specificity, the measurability, and the time horizon that will be most helpful in your annual planning. So first, the S, specificity. When looking at your long-term goals, you want to make sure that it's clear to your team exactly what is to be achieved. That way, you can identify, work, and set annual goals that are within that container. So you want to make sure that the goals at the long-term level are specific enough so that everybody is on the same page about what actually the goal is. And if you find that the specificity is lacking, just like with the vision and the priorities, you want to clarify at the long-term level before you start setting annual work plan goals for you and your team. Right? So if you find that there's a problem with the specificity, address it in the long-term plan, either with conversations with your team. You can even just say, okay, let's all decide now what we think this goal means, right? It made sense to us when we said it. Things have changed. It's not actually as specific as we thought. Let's add some specificity. You may want to bring your board in depending on the nature of the goal, but bring the specificity to bear at the long-term strategic plan level. Next, the M, measurability. You want to make sure that your long-term goals are crafted in a way that makes it really clear when the goal has been met, what counts as success. And the reason that that's relevant on the annual planning level is that long-term goals often have milestones, right? They define success and they say, this is how we are measuring our process to get there, right? Our progress. These are milestones that will count as success along the way. So you want to make sure that those milestones are clear so that you'll know what you need to do in the upcoming year to move in the direction of the milestone or the end goal. That's how the long-term goal relates to your annual planning. That measurability is probably the most important thing about the goal. How will we know at the end of this year that we have made some kind of progress towards achieving the long-term goal? The only way you'll be able to know that with any clarity is if that long-term goal itself is measurable. And then finally, the most other relevant aspect of your sort of 3-year SMARTY goals is the T, time bound. This is where you just want to check to make sure that your goals, if they have deadlines, timeframes, or milestones that are time bound or that build on one another, you want to check to make sure that that information is clear so that that can be reflected in your annual plan. If you have a 3-year goal and it's really important that certain milestones be achieved in year 1 in order to set you up for goals in year 2, you need to know that when you craft your year 1 annual plan, right? So gut checking or going back and checking against that T, the time bound part of the goals, is really important in making sure that your annual plans trickle back up to and move you in the direction of your long-term plans. So the last thing that I'll say about this audit process is that it does not need to take a long time. My recommendation is that you and your leadership team allocate 90 minutes to 2 hours tops to sit with your long-term plan and walk through these questions. As you come across places where the plan lacks something, lacks clarity, there's jargon, too many priorities, not enough specificity, note that, right? And like I've said, the general rule of thumb is address the challenge at the long-term plan level. If there's a lack of clarity, have a conversation or set a time in your calendar to have a conversation to bring some clarity. You're not talking about revisiting what the priority is or what the goal is, right? So there shouldn't be anxiety about having to sort of revisit and revamp your strategic plan. That is not what I'm talking about. All I'm talking about is when you sit down to make sure that the annual work that you're doing is aligned with and feeds back into your long-term plans, making sure that the long-term plans are clear, right? That everybody's defining things the same way, that the priorities that you want to be focused on are the ones that you're focused on, and decide that at the long-term plan level. So that's the general rule of thumb. Very often you can do this in 90 minutes to 2 hours. If you find that the plan lacks something, I've seen organizations set aside either one additional meeting or, oh, you know what, we're going to have this person on our team go and actually sort of draft what they think the priorities are, or we're going to check in with our board chair and just make sure that of the 7 priorities, these are really the 3 that feel most pressing. These do not have to be long, drawn out conversations, but I cannot emphasize this enough. I highly recommend doing them on the front end of your annual work planning, your annual budgeting, and definitely your annual fundraising, because that's how you'll make sure that each of those yearly plans is actually leading you in the direction you want to go. So I have included some suggested remedies for each of these key attributes. If you find that there's no clarity, there's too much jargon, etc., I've included some of those suggested remedies in the cheat sheet, which, as a reminder, you can get at richie-babbage.com/strat-plan-audit. And that is it for today. As I said at the beginning, use this time of the year to do an audit of your long-term plan so that it can be a powerful tool in your annual planning. Look at your vision and priorities and goals one at a time. Check them against the list of the attributes that I walked through here. And when there's confusion, start with the long-term plan first, and then it will trickle down to your annual plan. One last time, if you weren't able to take notes or you'd like a resource to share with your team, cheat sheet is at richie-babbage.com/strat-plan-audit. I will see you back here next week for more Mastermind. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast. I always have so much fun doing these episodes. Definitely check out the links to all the goodies that I mentioned in this episode. You can get that at richie-babbage.com/podcast for the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode and think that you have a friend or colleague who would also enjoy, I would love if you would leave a review and share. Have a great week.